In the barren expanses of the Kazakh steppe, hidden far from the eyes of the world, the Soviet Union conducted one of its many nuclear tests in the early 1980s. This was no ordinary explosion. It was a classified operation involving an underground detonation, monitored by an elite circle of engineers, scientists, and KGB operatives. The entire test was meant to be undetectable by foreign powers. The Soviets had ensured that the test site was locked down with multiple layers of physical and electronic security. Communications were tightly controlled. Signals were scrambled. The site was isolated, shielded from overhead satellite surveillance by both terrain and sophisticated camouflage tactics. From Moscow's perspective, the detonation would remain a ghost unseen, unheard, untraceable. But while Soviet commanders reviewed seismic data and congratulated themselves on another successful test, something deeply unsettling was happening on the other side of the world, in a windowless U.S. intelligence facility. Deep beneath a secure building, a group of analysts gathered around a classified audio monitoring system. Moments earlier, they had received a signal transmitted automatically from a sensor they had embedded through an unknown channel in a location the Soviets never suspected. The signal wasn't just noise, it was detailed, it was raw, it was a full acoustic and seismic profile of the test that had just taken place, including pressure waveforms, structural reverberations, and even background chatter picked up from Soviet personnel. The shock came not just from the data itself, but from what it revealed. Someone, somewhere, had placed a listening device inside the most secretive Soviet military program of all its nuclear testing network. The Soviets had always suspected the Americans might have advanced listening capabilities, but the clarity of this capture and the speed with which it reached U.S. analysts suggested something far more terrifying. This wasn't intercepted radio chatter or long-range seismic inference. It was a real-time eavesdrop proof that the United States had either compromised Soviet infrastructure or had developed a new generation of intelligence tools the Kremlin hadn't even imagined. That night, behind the walls of the Soviet Ministry of Defense and the offices of the KGB, alarm bells went off. A leak of this magnitude wasn't just a security failure. It was a direct threat to the Soviet Union's nuclear credibility. If America could hear their bombs before they exploded, what else could they see? To understand how the U.S. managed to record such a tightly guarded Soviet nuclear test, we need to go back to the roots of one of the most secretive branches of American intelligence, the Acoustic Intelligence Program, or ACINT, born in the shadows of the Cold War. ACINT was conceived by a small cadre of scientists, engineers, and military planners who recognized a simple but powerful truth. Sound travels farther than sight, and in many cases, it tells a clearer story. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the United States invested heavily in underwater sonar arrays to track Soviet submarines. But ACINT extended far beyond the ocean. Engineers began deploying passive listening devices disguised as geological instruments, weather stations, and even disguised animal tracking equipment. These systems were built to monitor low-frequency acoustic signatures from miles away, everything from jet engines to missile launches to underground nuclear detonations. One of the breakthroughs came when a specialized team developed microseismic acoustic sensors that could detect faint pressure waves from deep beneath the Earth's surface. These sensors didn't just pick up the boom of a nuclear blast. They could detect the sequence of events before and after, like mechanical noises, detonation triggers, even conversations among personnel if positioned close enough. To make this work inside the Soviet Union, the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, launched one of their boldest operations, embedding an array of passive sensors near suspected nuclear test sites. This wasn't done through traditional espionage alone. Some were inserted via covert drone drops, others planted by spies or Allied operatives posing as civilians. A few were even placed decades earlier and activated remotely when technology caught up. By the 1980s, these sensors were feeding data into a classified U.S. satellite relay system, which transmitted real-time recordings to processing centers across the United States. The system was so advanced that even low-powered devices could piggyback their data onto ambient communication signals, making them almost impossible to detect with Soviet counter-surveillance tools. The Soviets had no idea such a system existed. And when the U.S. recorded one of their most secret nuclear tests with near-perfect clarity, it wasn't just a victory for American intelligence. It was a sign that the balance of strategic secrecy had shifted forever. In the early hours of a chilly spring morning, deep within a remote region of Soviet Central Asia, technicians prepared for what was supposed to be a routine underground nuclear test. The operation was part of a continuing series of experiments aimed at refining warhead yields and delivery system compatibility. For the Soviet military, this was standard procedure. Every element of the process followed long-established protocols, and secrecy was absolute, or so they thought. As the countdown began and final checks were made, no one noticed anything unusual. The device was lowered into its shaft, armed, and sealed with reinforced concrete. Soviet officers stood in reinforced observation bunkers, above ground. Security patrols swept for intruders, while radar and radio jamming systems scanned for foreign signals. Then came the detonation. A muffled roar shook the earth, registering a magnitude strong enough to rattle windows in villages dozens of kilometers away. Soviet sensors recorded everything precisely as expected. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that hundreds of miles away, inside a nondescript building on a U.S. airbase, a set of monitors lit up. Audio waveforms spiked. Seismic readouts matched expected blast characteristics. And most chilling of all, several seconds of pre-detonation audio chatter between technicians. Last-minute checklist items had been picked up with chilling clarity. What should have been a sealed operation had, in effect, been live-streamed to the enemy. The recordings were quickly analyzed by American defense analysts. Not only did they gain precise data on the blast's yield and signature, but they also now had the voices of Soviet scientists, their procedural language, and background details that revealed far more than just the bomb's performance. This was more than an intelligence coup. It was a technological humiliation for the Soviets. When Soviet counterintelligence finally caught wind weeks later that the Americans knew more about the test than anyone outside the Kremlin should have, panic set in. How where? When their entire assumption of internal security had been shattered. And this was just the beginning of a deeper unraveling. The device that captured the Soviet nuclear secrets wasn't a bulky Cold War relic. It was a marvel of miniaturization and ingenuity, roughly the size of a matchbox. This spy bug housed highly sensitive microphones and data storage components, shielded to survive intense radiation and pressure. Engineers designed it to operate autonomously for weeks, requiring no external power source or maintenance. Once triggered by seismic activity or specific audio signatures, the device would activate, recording everything from technician chatter to countdown sequences and detonation data. What made the technology particularly dangerous to Soviet secrecy was its ability to remain undetected, buried within infrastructure or camouflaged in debris near test zones The bug bypassed routine, sweeps by, blending into the environment. It even had fail-safes to self-destruct or transmit encrypted bursts of data, minimizing the risk of recovery by Soviet counterintelligence. For U.S. analysts, the bug provided invaluable data, yield estimations, weapon design parameters, and test protocols, giving them a clearer picture of Soviet nuclear capabilities than satellite imagery or intercepted radio chatter ever could. The Soviets had prided themselves on airtight security around their nuclear tests, yet this one device unraveled years of carefully guarded military advancements. The information retrieved from the bug was nothing short of revolutionary. As American analysts decoded the data, they uncovered seismic wave patterns, weapon detonation sequences, and even snippets of spoken commands in Russian from inside the Soviet test control bunkers. It was the kind of intelligence agencies dream of: direct, unfiltered, and impossible to obtain through conventional surveillance. Among the haul were critical parameters about the yield of nuclear devices, the efficiency of plutonium compression, and the reliability of Soviet triggering mechanisms. The U.S. now knew which test designs were successful, which failed, and where the Soviets were focusing their future development. Even more alarmingly for the Soviets, some of the recordings revealed candid conversations among scientists and military officials, including expressions of doubt about certain technologies. These insights allowed the U.S. to assess not just technical capabilities, but morale, internal disagreements, and strategic planning in a single operation. The CIA had pierced the Iron Curtain not with a satellite or a spy plane, but with a tiny, nearly invisible device that sat quietly in the heart of the enemy's most secret program, rewriting the rules of intelligence gathering in the nuclear age. When Soviet counterintelligence finally uncovered the hidden listening device, the revelation caused immediate chaos. The discovery didn't occur during a routine sweep. It came after signs began to emerge that the United States was responding to nuclear test outcomes with uncanny precision. American diplomatic moves and weapons development began aligning too perfectly with what had only been discussed behind closed doors inside Soviet test ranges. Suspicion turned into alarm. A full-scale investigation was launched, sweeping every control room, testing chamber, and underground bunker. Eventually, the bug was found disguised as part of an electrical cable system buried deep within a monitoring structure. The news reached the upper echelons of the Kremlin like a bombshell. Soviet leaders were stunned to realize their nuclear secrets had been leaking in real time. Trust in their own internal security systems collapsed overnight. Panic set in across the defense sector. Technicians were interrogated, and KGB officials were dispatched to oversee emergency overhauls of all security infrastructure. Not only had their nuclear advancements been compromised, but the psychological blow was devastating. The KGB feared similar devices could be planted in other sensitive areas: missile silos, submarine docks, even Politburo offices. The breach wasn't just technical, it was existential. For American intelligence agencies, the success of the covert listening operation was a gold mine. The spy bug had transmitted not just snippets of Soviet nuclear activity, but entire testing sequences, design parameters, and classified discussions about warhead yields and delivery systems. Washington now had a window into Moscow's most guarded military advancements. Armed with this information, U.S. policymakers and defense planners began shaping strategy with an edge the Soviets couldn't detect. Negotiation teams at arms control talks suddenly held data that allowed them to challenge Soviet claims with chilling accuracy, catching their adversaries off guard. On the military fronts, American missile defenses were recalibrated based on the exact capabilities of Soviet warheads. Aircraft payloads were adjusted. Submarine patrols were repositioned. The intelligence shaped everything from nuclear doctrine to budget decisions. At the White House and Pentagon, the bug's intel fueled a quiet confidence. Officials didn't need to guess what the Soviets were building, they already knew. And that knowledge translated into real leverage in diplomacy, in arms control, and in deterrence. As the Soviets scrambled to contain the damage, the U.S. doubled down on black operations and technological espionage. Knowing now that success wasn't just possible, it was already reshaping the balance of the Cold War. The long-term ramifications of the bugging operation rippled through the final decade of the Cold War. For the Soviets, it represented a catastrophic breach of operational security, one that forced sweeping overhauls of test site protocols, cryptographic systems, and internal counterintelligence measures. Paranoia surged within the KGB and GRU, leading to internal purges and distrust even among senior commanders. On the American side, the operation validated the effectiveness of signal intelligence and micro-surveillance technology, accelerating a new era of miniaturized espionage tools. It paved the way for advanced acoustic monitoring, fiber optic surveillance, and even satellite-enhanced eavesdropping. The success emboldened CIA black programs and justified increased funding for covert technology initiatives. Geopolitically, the intelligence windfall enabled the United States to engage in nuclear diplomacy from a position of dominance. With accurate knowledge of Soviet capabilities, UN negotiators pushed harder in arms reduction talks while maintaining strategic superiority. This information advantage also contributed to a more confident posture in NATO war planning, deterring Soviet aggression by ensuring that American responses would be both timely and devastatingly precise. In hindsight, this single act of espionage, one tiny device buried deep inside a Soviet test site, had outsized consequences. It undermined the Soviet Union's sense of invulnerability, destabilized their strategic assumptions, and helped the U.S. cement a critical advantage in the final stretch of the Cold War. The discovery of the U.S. spy bug sent shockwaves through Soviet intelligence circles, realizing the devastating implications of the breach. Soviet engineers and counterintelligence officers were immediately deployed to comb every inch of their nuclear testing facilities. Entire test ranges were shut down temporarily as forensic teams scoured bunkers, control rooms, and underground tunnels for additional devices. The KGB and GRU launched massive internal investigations, suspecting foreign infiltration or traitors within their scientific and military corps. Personnel who had access to the test sites during construction or maintenance were interrogated, relocated, or dismissed. Some were even arrested under suspicion of espionage or negligence. Technologically, the Soviets began retrofitting their test sites with electronic shielding and acoustic dampening systems. They redesigned instrumentation to operate in secure, isolated nodes with minimal electromagnetic emissions, Faraday cages, scrambling systems, and white noise generators were installed to confuse or neutralize potential surveillance tools. Additionally, the Soviet Union reassessed its entire approach to test documentation and communication. Sensitive data was compartmentalized, encrypted with new algorithms, and transferred via secure, hardwired channels instead of open radio links. Meetings related to test results were held in shielded rooms under strict surveillance. Despite these aggressive countermeasures, the incident sowed lasting paranoia. Soviet planners feared that if one bug could be planted without detection, More could already be operational, silently collecting secrets across critical sectors. That fear would linger until the end of the Cold War. The spy bug scandal ignited a technological arms race in the shadowy world of espionage. The United States and the Soviet Union found themselves locked in a relentless game of cat and mouse, each side developing ever more advanced surveillance tools, and the other scrambling to detect and neutralize them. For the CIA and NSA, the success of the nuclear test recording validated years of black budget research. Encouraged by the results, American engineers pushed forward with smaller, smarter, and more autonomous surveillance devices. Microphones disguised as bolts, fiber optic cables woven into communication lines, and seismic sensors mimicking rocks were deployed across the globe. Meanwhile, the KGB and GRU retaliated with sweeping security upgrades. Every Soviet installation of strategic value became a fortress of counter-surveillance. Security sweeps using radio frequency scanners, magnetic anomaly detectors, and thermal imaging became routine. Even birds and rodents around sensitive sites were occasionally captured and inspected. Paranoia ruled the day. Spy satellites circled overhead, capturing high-resolution images from orbit. Submarines trailed each other silently through the ocean depths, tapping undersea cables and deploying unmanned probes. What began with a hidden bug in a nuclear bunker evolved into a global surveillance chess match, each move more secretive and sophisticated than the last. This invisible war, fought not with tanks or bombs but with microphones and microchips, showcased a different kind of power, one that didn't explode, but listened. The revelation that U.S. intelligence had successfully recorded Soviet nuclear test data without detection sent shockwaves through military and political circles. For the Kremlin, it wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a threat to national security and strategic balance. Soviet war planners had long operated under the assumption that their nuclear capabilities were shrouded in secrecy. Precise yield data, warhead performance, and advancements in delivery systems were considered classified at the highest levels. Now, it was clear that the Americans had intimate knowledge of their progress. This intelligence allowed US analysts to build highly accurate models of Soviet warhead design and reliability. In arms control negotiations, it gave American diplomats leverage. They knew which Soviet claims were bluffs and which were real. It also provided critical data for developing effective missile defenses and nuclear countermeasures. In response, Soviet engineers were forced to redesign testing protocols, isolate facilities, and shift to underground or digitally encrypted data collection. But even these efforts lagged behind U.S. surveillance innovation. The balance of power had subtly but significantly shifted, not on the battlefield, but in the unseen realm of intelligence. The strategic implication was clear in the modern era. The winner wouldn't just be the side with the most firepower, but the side that knew the most first. In the months following the discovery of the espionage breach, the Soviet Union undertook an extensive internal investigation. Intelligence chiefs were grilled, security protocols were overhauled, and a sweeping purge of suspected leakers occurred within their scientific and military communities. Yet the real damage had already been done. The revelation sparked a deep paranoia in Soviet intelligence circles. If the Americans could tap their most secure nuclear test data, what else might they have compromised? Commanders grew suspicious of every wire, every device, every technician. Trust eroded at every level of classified operations. Meanwhile, in the West, the success of the spy bug operation became a case study in how precision intelligence could shape the global balance without firing a shot. For the CIA and NSA, it was a triumph of planning, patience, and technological innovation. Reflecting on the operation, former U.S. officials acknowledged that the intelligence gathered may have prevented dangerous miscalculations. By understanding Soviet capabilities in detail, the U.S. could avoid both overestimating and underestimating the nuclear threat, each scenario carrying its own peril. Ultimately, the fallout wasn't measured in explosive yields or battlefield losses, but in shifted perceptions and broken confidence. The Cold War was as much a war of minds as of machines, and in this battle, America had once again proved that information was its most potent weapon.